Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Business and Travel Podcast. My name is Jackson Dean, and today we are joined by Chris Widener. Very, very cool guest that we're going to have on the show today. He was named a top 50 speaker in the world. He was Inc. Magazine's top 100 leadership speakers, and he's a New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling author. A really, really interesting guest. We've got a lot to go through today and some awesome stuff that he's got on the radar as far as content goes. He's been around a very, very long time, for nearly 30 years now. He's answered some of the questions for audiences at some of America's finest organizations, including Microsoft, AT&T, General Electric, Cisco Systems, and the Harvard Business School. He's done over 1,200 presentations to audiences as large as 20,000 people. So really lucky to have him on the show today. We're going to give you guys some really good value. But Chris, how are you, my man? And thank you for being on the show.
Well, as my mentor Zig Ziglar would say, if I was any better, I'd have to be twins. So I'm doing pretty good and happy to be on the show with you.
Awesome, Chris. Well, run us through a little bit of what you're doing currently. And obviously, you've got a colorful history in business, and we'll dig into that throughout the episode. But what are you working on currently, and how's that all going for you?
Yeah, I am actually doing a couple of different things that I'm super excited about. As always, I'm a speaker. I've been speaking since 1988 and written a ton of books. I think I'm at about 20 now. I have a new book coming out, which is part of an overall thing that I'm doing. A buddy of mine, Larry Wingett, who's a 6-time New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling author, he and I have a podcast called The Real Man Podcast. It's dealing with men's issues. And we have a book coming out here in a few weeks called The Real Man's Hand Guide, 12 Commitments Real Men Make. And it's a challenge for men to, get back down to the nitty gritty of being real men. So super excited about that. And then I have a new business book that I'm just beginning to write and collecting all the information for it and everything, called How to Become a World-Class Dealmaker. And so it's all about putting deals together and negotiating, and really about the kind of person you need to become to be able to be a deal maker. So it's a little bit about the structure of deals and how to do deals, but it's more about what kind of people become world-class deal makers.
All right, so let's dig into that if we want to kick off a little bit of values. So when it comes to what sort of characteristics it takes, what do you find are some of the core things that you would look for in a businessman that's looking to pull off, world-class deals?
Well, the first and foremost thing, I always say there's one number one, and the rest of them you can put in whatever order you want. The first one is always the first one, and the first one is always integrity. All relationships in business and really in life are based on trust, right? So whether it's a business partnership, or it's a relationship between a buyer and a seller, or it's a relationship between a husband and wife, it has to do with trust, right? And so integrity is what builds trust. And integrity is an interesting word. I do seminars all over the world, and I've asked this following question to about 1 million people. If you were to look at the internet, read the news, read a newspaper, would you say that we have a problem with integrity in our modern world? Religion, politics, business, whatever. Everybody's hand goes up. But then I ask a follow-up question, and I say, how many of you would describe yourself as a person with little or no integrity? And I've asked that question of 1 million people, and no one has ever raised their hand. When I ask that question of the first question of 1 million people, how many would say that our modern world has a problem with integrity? Everybody's hand goes up, 1 million people. When I ask the follow-up question, how many of you are part of the problem? No one's hand has ever gone up. And it made me realize that there's a discrepancy. Everybody thinks there's a problem with integrity, but nobody thinks they're part of the problem. So what I found was that everybody thinks that they have integrity. And what I found in my research was the reason why is because when somebody else does something wrong, we judge them on their actions. But when we do something wrong, we don't judge our actions, we judge our intentions. But everybody else is judging our actions. And that's the discrepancy. When we do something wrong, they're judging our actions and deciding that we lack integrity to some degree or another. But we look at our intentions and we think nothing of it. We think, I just made a mistake, but it's no big deal because I didn't mean to. So what we need to do as entrepreneurs and business people, and frankly, just as human beings, is we need to look at our own actions, and we need to decide how those would be perceived by other people if they're not judging our intentions, but simply judging our actions. So in context of becoming a world-class deal maker, if people don't trust you, if people don't think you're going to tell them the truth, if people don't think that you're going to give them a win-win deal, they're not going to do a deal with you. Eventually they just, you call them up and they just let it go through to voicemail.
Yeah, no, 100% true. Do you feel like it's a little bit of a challenge or a bit difficult when you're the entrepreneur or you're the business owner and maybe you don't have a partner? I mean, in my situation, for example, I don't have partners in my business, so you're sort of flying solo quite a bit at the top. And do you feel like there's a bit of a trend where it's difficult to have that accountability, or it's difficult to have the guidance or the know-how of what actually is the right thing to do in all those different situations? Whereas back when, obviously you go through the system, you've got a school teacher, you've got a university lecturer, you've got your parents, you've got all these people that'll keep you in check and make you accountable to doing the right things. Do you feel like there's a problem there when you're sitting at the top and you don't have people to rely on? And how do you go about sort of, I guess, fixing that?
No, I actually have a counterintuitive belief about accountability, and I don't believe that anybody can keep you accountable. I believe that people can ask you questions, but I don't believe anybody can keep you accountable. I think you are the sole source of your own accountability. I'll give you an example. Let's say somebody struggles with drugs and they say, I'm going to get off of drugs, and you're going to be my accountability partner. I need you to ask me every day if I'm doing drugs. You can ask me every single day, but if I want to do drugs and then just look you straight in the eye and tell you, no, I didn't do any drugs today, you can't keep me accountable. The only thing that decides whether or not we're going to be accountable is whether we're accountable to ourselves and we're honest with ourselves and we look ourselves in the mirror and we get a real strong sense of self-awareness and we become accountable. So I don't really believe in accountability. I believe that people can try to hold us accountable. I think that they can ask the question, but if a person's willing to lie, which millions and millions of people are, whether it's drug abuse or alcoholism or, whatever it might be, stealing money from the business pot, whatever it might be, right? People have proven over the course of human history that they're all willing to do all sorts of crazy stuff and look into the eyes of somebody else and tell them that they didn't do it. So what I think is that people can choose their own decision about whether they're going to have integrity or not, and then they live that out regardless of whether somebody else is trying to keep them accountable or not.
Yeah, no, it's a really good take on it for sure. Yeah, let's bring it back to the integrity side of things. When you've got that accountability, what do you feel is the way that you can decipher whether or not you're dealing with someone in business that has integrity and has trust? What are some of the key sort of tells that you're looking for?
Well, it's interesting. When you first meet somebody, the first thing you see is their skills, right? So let's just say you meet somebody, you're at the Chamber of Commerce or you're at some sort of business networking meeting or somebody's put you together or something like that. The first thing you notice is their skills. You notice things like their intellect, you notice their ability to communicate, their ability to strategize. Character takes a little bit longer to understand. And character is about measuring their actions against their words and their values. So it always takes a little bit longer, which is why it's probably important not to rush into any sort of deal with people. Or if you don't know somebody, they have to come through somebody with whom you have impeccable trust. I'll give you an example. The other day, a guy calls me up and we're talking, and he is in the coffee business, and he brings it in from another country, and he's having trouble getting it in, just all the imports and all the stuff. And I said, hey, how would you like to have a US-based coffee producer? Because he's in Los Angeles. And he said, I'd love one. I said, great, call this guy. And he's huge, he's great, he's wonderful. And literally within a week, they did a deal that's worth at least $5 million and maybe up to about $50 million a year, because huge distribution. Now, neither one of these guys knew each other from a hole in the ground. But I was the pivotal point, and they both trust me. So they were using my integrity that I've built with them. One of the business owners, the guy who wants to buy the coffee, is a longtime 30-year friend of my fiance. So they've got a long history of trust and reputation. The coffee guy, and I've known him for probably 3 or 4 months, but so I'm sort of borrowing the reputation from my fiance because he knows her, right? But then I know this coffee roaster. I've known him for 10 years, good friend, done business together. And so all of it is weighted upon sort of borrowing the integrity of other people. These two guys going into this big business don't know each other, but they can trust the other person even after knowing each other just a little bit because of 30-year history, 10-year history, where it's impeccable integrity, right? So you either find your own integrity in the relationship with them over time, or you borrow integrity through references and things like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that's kind of like an actual real example of it's not what you know, it's who you know. And
yeah, in fact, that's one of the chapters in my new book. It's not, it really, the chapter's called, It Really Is All About Who You Know.
Yeah, it is. And I can vouch for that. I mean, I've never done any sort of big business without really personally knowing someone for quite a few months beforehand. And or getting that reference. You know, you got to have almost the testimonial from someone that you really trust to validate whether or not you're going to lose it all or win it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I helped a young man get a $500,000 investment. 27-year-old kid got a $500,000 investment literally with a phone call with a couple of guys who've known me for probably 15 years, 13 to 15 years, done business with them. And this kid needed some investment money, called him up, put him on a phone call. And after the kid talked to him for 10 minutes, they said, "We're in. We just need to nail down the details, but we're in." Now, on one hand, to these guys, $500,000 is not a lot. They just sold their company for hundreds of millions of dollars. But on the other hand, $500,000 is still a lot, right?
Yeah.
But they knew that I wouldn't bring them a deal that wasn't vetted and those kinds of things. So very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. So have you done much work in the VC space or venture capital space?
No, you know what? I write business books, and through doing that, I end up meeting a ton of people. I just passed over 15,000 contacts on LinkedIn. You open my phone, I've got billionaires, athletes, rock stars, that kind of thing. And not because I went to look to become a deal maker, but in living my own life, writing business books, maintaining my own integrity, I've gotten to know a lot of people who do deals. And so what I've been able to do is to put people together. I'll give you an example. I was walking through a Major League Baseball stadium once with the chief financial officer of the baseball team, Major League Baseball team. And we were coming back from lunch. And we were walking up some stairs, and I saw a sign, and I said, "Hey, who does your sign business?" And he said, "Oh, such and such." And I said, "Oh, you need to call this friend of mine. I bet he'd beat these guys on price." And, he owns a big sign company. And I found out, and literally all I did was gave him the phone number. And I found out a few months later that they did something like $160,000 in signs right away. And then I found out about a year later, they were doing about $500,000 a year in signs at this stadium. And so a lot of it for me is just putting people together. And that serves me, sometimes I get a piece of the action, sometimes I don't, which is another one of my chapters, create massive value for other people, sometimes for free. But a lot of it is it builds me a lot of goodwill. It opens up a lot of good doors for me. Even if I don't get paid on it, I get paid other ways. So for me, I'm not like literally in the business of deal making, but over the course of my career, I've done lots of deals.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things you touched on there, which I've got a word for, is social capital, and it's something that I learned well. It's completely changed my mindset when I went over to Israel, and that was earlier this year. And everyone who listens to the show, knows that a few of those earlier episodes are just based entirely off this concept of social capital, where their culture in Israel is just so different to America. It's so different to Australia. It's just so different everywhere. And it's because all of them grow up and have to go into the military for 3 years. So sort of everyone kind of knows everyone that way.
Yeah.
And they all just help each other none of them understand the idea of paid consulting. They just believe that all consulting should be free, all information should be free, everything should be shared. And by doing that as a country, all of them sort of inadvertently build each other up just by giving people, free connections, free contacts, free meetings. As an example, when I was there, I literally just got on my phone. I was talking to a guy who said, you should hit up the CEO of one of their biggest law firms in Israel, a law firm doing, close to $1 billion a year. And I was like, okay, what do I do? He goes, oh, here's the email. Just flick him a quick email and see when he's available. And that's just kind of already weird to me, because usually you'd have to talk to the assistant and get a meeting, sometime 7 months later. But I just sent a message. I just said, hey, I'm an Australian entrepreneur over here with, a bunch of different people. And would like to sit down and grab a coffee. And literally 30 minutes later, I had a message back saying, meet me downstairs in half an hour for a coffee. Turned my mic on and got a whole podcast episode off him in the first few minutes of meeting the guy. And that's a huge CEO who's got 1,000 different things to do. But that all comes back to him just providing value in advance. He has no idea how that's going to come back in the future, but that's just the way that they've been trained and taught to do business. And it's just a really cool concept of what social capital is. And it's why I actually run this podcast. And it's why, even yourself, you're doing a guest appearance. It's time out of your day. It's time out of our day. But for the listeners, it's value. And we have no idea how that comes back, but it's about providing value and putting into the entrepreneurial ecosystem as much value as we can give from our experience. And who knows what that does in the future.
Yeah, Zig Ziglar was a mentor of mine. We had a television show together called True Performance, and Zig used to say, you can have anything you want in life if you just help enough other people get what they want out of life. And I often am reminded of the old biblical literature that says, give and it shall be given to you. A good measure pressed and shaken down will be filled to overflowing, right? So when you give and it comes back to you, right? And different religions think different things and different people have different ideas, but that concept of giving and it comes back to you is represented throughout human history in all sorts of literature, both religious and non-religious. And I think it's absolutely true.
Yeah, I firmly believe it. It's hard to know how it comes back, and it's the point. You're not supposed to know, and you're not supposed to care either. You're supposed to do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and sometimes it doesn't come back. And if it doesn't come back that one time or, 10% of the time, okay, no big deal.
And that's it. So what about on the sales side of things? I mean, obviously you got a really long career of sales experience. What are some really high quality tips that you can give based off your experience in the sales world?
I'll tell you about one of the first, probably not the first, because I was buying and selling stuff when I was a little kid. But my second chapter is called It's Just as Easy to Think Big as It Is to Think Small. And on a number of occasions over the course of my lifetime, this has played out. But I'll tell you a really funny story. When I was 14 years old, my mom was working at Group Health Hospital, which was a big hospital in the Seattle area. And she was working with a guy who he worked in the filing department. So literally all this guy did all day long was take files, go back and put them into this big filing room. But, as you can imagine, he got tired of that. He wanted to make more money, et cetera, et cetera. So he borrowed, and this was, I was 14, so this was 1980. He borrowed $7,000 from a rich uncle, and he bought the license for a territory for a self-watering flower pot. Now, this flower pot was two parts. It was plastic. The bottom part is where you put the water, and the top part, which fit into the bottom part, is where you put the dirt and the plant. And then the top part sat down with a little nipple that went down into the water below it. And then based on where you slid the dial that came out the side, it would suck a lot of water up into the dirt, or it would suck very little water up into the dirt. So if it was all the way to the left, you'd put it all the way to the left for a cactus. If you slid it all the way to the right, which needed a lot of water, it might be an African violet or something like that. So this guy says to me, because he knew me, because I would hang out there waiting for my mom or whatever. He said, "Hey, Chris, how would you like to make some money?" And I said, "Sure, I'd love to make some money." He says, "I need you to sell some flower pots." And I said, "Okay, fine, I'll sell some flower pots." So he thought I was going to go door to door and sell them to grandmas, right? I said, "How much am I going to make per pot?" He said, "I'll pay you $1 per pot that you sell." I said, "Okay, done." He thought I was going to go door to door and knock on the door and sell them to little old ladies. What I did was I called up Ernst Home Centers, which at the time had, I don't know, 100 stores, who knows how many stores, all over Washington, Oregon, Idaho. I called him up and I said, "Hey, I'd like to come in and meet with a buyer and show you a self-watering flower pot." Now, I was 14 years old. I couldn't drive myself to the meeting, and my mom bought me my first ever blue blazer. So I was wearing a blue blazer my mom bought me that barely fit me because I was 14 years old, and she drove me down and dropped me off in downtown Seattle. I went into a high rise and waited for this guy. And when he opened the door and saw this 14-year-old kid in front of him, he was a little surprised. And so I walked in and I just let the pot do its own speaking. I showed him how it worked. I put water in the bottom. I stuck the top pot in. I didn't have any dirt or anything, but I slid the dial and he saw the water come up into it. And he said, "I'll tell you what, I'll buy 4 boxes per month for 25 of my stores for a year." So let's do the math on that. Let's say that there were 25 pots in a box. It was actually 24, but it'll help me do the math. 25 per box. So that's 4 boxes per store. So that's 100 per store times 25 stores is 2,500 pots a month times a year is 30,000 pots. I sold 30,000 pots on my first, and as the story ends, my only sales call I ever made working for that guy. So I sold 30,000 pots. And I come back to him and I said, "Hey, I sold some pots." And he said, "Really? How many did you sell?" And I said, "I sold 30,000 pots." And he freaked out. And I said, he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, I just sold 30,000 pots to Ernst Home Center, 2,500 per month for a year." And I kid you not, Jackson, he got so afraid of success. He went back to the company, got his $7,000 up, got his $7,000 back, and gave up the business. And I never sold a single pot, even though I'd cut a deal. And the greatest irony is that it was a drop ship order. He didn't really even have to do anything except tell the company to mail him 2,500 pots to their distribution center every month. But that's a whole nother podcast to talk about why some people get afraid of success. But what it made me realize at a very early age was it's just as easy to think big as it is to think small.
It's true. It really is true. You've only got so much brain activity per day before you want to fall asleep. How are you going to spend it? You're gonna waste it. And it's like that. There's a really good quote where they say, if you lost $10 on the ground, would you care? And you're like, "Oh, wouldn't really care, would I?" What if you lost, $80,000? You're like, "Yeah, I would care." Well, every single day you've got 80,000 seconds, or close enough to it. And someone's taken away 10 seconds of that time with something negative. Are you going to concentrate the other 80,000 seconds on the negativity, or are you going to refocus it on the positivity? And if you can figure that out and master your own mindset, so many things in life. It's just mindset. It's really not too much to do with what's your skill set and what's your knowledge and experience and everything else. It's really just what's your mindset for that day and what's your mindset for that week and month. And if your mindset's positive, you're always going to get a better result. And thinking big is always the way to think. If you're thinking, you might as well think big.
Yeah, absolutely. There's plenty of people who think small. And you look back over the course of business history, like I don't know if you saw the movie called The Founder, which was about Ray Kroc. There's a classic example, right? The McDonald's brothers were thinking about small. They were thinking about keeping it small. They only wanted to keep it small. They had a nice little lifestyle. And frankly, there's nothing wrong with that. The backbone of society is on the small business owner, right? And they provide a great service. They provide great services, programs, products, and the like. But there's always somebody who says, well, instead of owning one hamburger stand, how about if I own 1,500 hamburger stands? There's maids who will come and clean your house. And then there's the people who say, what if I hired 1,000 maids, put them into groups of 2, and I had 500 crews working, and we call it super maids, right? There's people who think small, and it's not that thinking small is bad, because again, most businesses are one shop operations. But if you want to make money, you want to make wealth, you want to build a big business, it's just as easy to think big as it is to think small.
Yeah, and there's so much information out there on, the actual strategy behind thinking big. There's thinking it, but then there's doing it. There's being interested in something, and then there's being committed to doing something. So it's, you can think big, but then it's, now what? What's the next step?
In fact, Fortune magazine did a thing called Why CEOs Fail, probably before you were born, Jackson. They did a research project. It was fascinating. They started out with a premise. They wanted to find out why it is that CEOs failed. And their premise, they wrote about this when they finally came out with the article. Their premise was that CEOs failed because they lacked vision. Vision was the thing. Everybody was talking about have vision. And so they probably thought the answer was going to be the reason CEOs fail is they have no vision. What they found out was the real reason that CEOs fail is they lack execution. It wasn't lack of vision that caused CEOs to fail because almost every CEO had a vision. It was the lack of or the inability to execute that caused CEOs to fail.
Which is really interesting because at the end of the day, if you're an actual CEO, your job is really to oversee all the other, C-level directors and be a master at delegating really and management. So it is interesting because I think execution, I know as far as I'm concerned in the few businesses that I run, it really is from my end a lot of delegation, just checks and balances, making sure when you delegate something, it gets done, and just building a really strong team around you. I mean, that's really the core things that I would be focusing on as a CEO is just delegating it to the right people and making sure it gets done. So that's goes hand in hand with thinking big. If you want to think big, you have to have a lot around you. You have to have a really good team around you. You have to have the right, skill sets around you, and you've got to have a lot of hands on deck to try and achieve big things. And I like to dilute business down into time instead of money because, you can buy more time with money. And so I look at each day, in an organization or when I would go in and I can consult thousands of different businesses around the world as well. And the main thing that I look at is time as a metric. So if people are trying to scale or think big, which I would reference that back to scaling big, trying to figure out how to scale something very big. My thing is drilling down on the actual time spent doing everything. And if you've got 40 employees, let's say 10 employees working for you, instead of having, 40 hours a week, well, now you have 400 hours a week. And what are you actually doing with that 400 hours? You yourself, you have 40 hours, but if you've gone and hired 10 people at a full time, well, you've got 440 hours to utilize all those people and deploy them into what you need them to do. And that's, for me, if you want to think big as far as time goes. How much time can you actually buy and where will you allocate that time that you have now bought? And if you can, buy, say, 400 hours of time per week, well, then, give it 6 months and you keep hiring and you keep scaling. And if it's a really good business model, why not have 4,000 hours of work at your disposal each week? And then you have 40,000 hours of work at your disposal each week. And if you scale up that time, you as one human being, you only have 24 hours in a day. But you've got access to money, which is access to more time, which is access to scale, which is access to thinking big.
Well, but where it gets really crazy is when you add in something that's never been able to be added in until modern times is automation and now artificial intelligence and the ability to scale. I said years ago, probably 10 years ago, I said that Jeff Bezos would be the first guy worth $100 billion. And, he was probably worth $4 billion at the time. But, I lived in Seattle, so I was very close. I had lots of friends that worked at Amazon and as well as Microsoft and some of the other places as well. But the use of automation and now artificial intelligence and the ability to recommend, think about how much money the automated upsell, right? When you go through a McDonald's and you order a burger, burger, and that person, that human being, has to say, would you like fries with that burger? Yes, I would. Would you like a shake with that burger and fries? Yes, I would. It's an exchange of time for money, right? You have to pay somebody to be there. But when you can automate the artificial intelligence to say, oh, okay, we're looking at the data, and 30% of all the people who bought this book also bought this book, and you just automatically, without even having to pay somebody for it, that's the ultimate scale, is automation and artificial intelligence. And we're living in a whole new world now.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And where I really got a first-hand look at that is, well, there's two scenarios here. I actually used to code artificial intelligence for automated trading systems. So we used to trade foreign exchange markets with automated robots, you could say, but it was built into the robot that we were writing the code for machine learning, or something where machine learns from its mistakes. And we would be trading these financial markets, and our robot or our algorithm, our trading system, it would get smarter every single day, which I thought was just crazy that you could.
Yeah, I just sat in the office of a hedge fund last week, and they're trading. Basically, their algorithms are monitoring and trading the emotional state of the market based on an elaborate put-call methodology.
Yep.
And it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's so intricate at that level. And I don't know the stats anymore because I've been out of the finance game and industry for about 4 years now. But when I was in the finance game real deep, I mean, I used to help manage a hedge fund myself. So I was overseeing all the accounts that were trading inside of those systems. And we, as finance professionals, we knew that 40% of all transactional volume at the time was done by robots, but 85% of all trades were being done within 4 seconds, bought and sold, both sides of the table. So no human being can, click the buttons quick enough to do that. So 85% of most trading volume, even if it's quite minute, is done by systems, not even done by people. Nearly all of our financial
wasn't that the advent of quantitative, where the quants were buying and selling, and they were comparing the Tokyo market to the London market to the New York market, and they were finding these small discrepancies and making the trade and just shaving off, sometimes a quarter of 1 penny, but they were doing it in such volume that they end up making millions of dollars over the course of time.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much what finance is. It's like if you want to define it in financial market, it's just arbitrage. And you have all of these companies that are trying to find these tiny little arbitrage opportunities, and then putting, $1 billion behind that tiny little arbitrage, which might be like 0.000000001. And they find this little discrepancy, but put $1 billion behind it, and then they make their money.
Well, did you read Fast Boys? I'm sure you read Fast Boys, and how now just finding how fast the information travels via fiber versus telephone lines. And they were finding that they could beat it by, a third of a second. But in that third of a second, they found an eighth of a point that they could trade and make the money.
It's crazy. It's just, it's so fine.
And that's all just technology. And that's technology and automation, which is exactly what we're talking about, that allows you to scale.
Yeah, and that hasn't been around. It hasn't been around for more than 2 decades, really. And it hasn't really been around for more than a decade to the general public, you could say. And so now I think that we're on a real continental shift of humanity, where if you're in the third world, if you're in the first world, it doesn't matter what your background is, what your history is. I believe that everyone has access to a smartphone. I mean, I've lived in the third world, and they all have smartphones. So, they save up and they buy themselves a smartphone because they know that information is power. And at the end of a smartphone, if you've got some internet, well, you have access to pretty much all of this information, and everyone's on the same playing field. Everyone, if they do the research, can find the same automation. They can find the same information. They can find the same, skills online to hire. There's so many things that is at the disposal of everyone. I feel like everyone as the human race, we all have the same at bat. We all have the same opportunity to build something big, as long as you think.
Well, I would agree with you 99%. The only thing that I think is one discrepancy would be the access to capital. There are a lot of people that just don't have access to capital. Of course, the more access to capital you have, the easier it is. It's easier to make money with money, right? If you have $10, you make 50%, you make $5. If you have $100 million, you make 50%, you make $50 million. So I think that, over the course of time, we're going to see some of these third world countries come into more access to capital and those kinds of things, because they certainly have the technology. I have a friend of mine a guy named John Stanton, who was the former CEO of Western Wireless and VoiceStream, sold it to T-Mobile, became the CEO of T-Mobile, left T-Mobile, and basically went his own business helping these third world countries go from literally no phones straight to cell phones. Because some of these countries, they didn't even have landlines. Like, nobody had landlines. Well, rather than laying cable and putting up landlines, they went straight from no communications to what you're talking about: cell phones, smartphones, those kinds of things, which allows them the ability to connect, but they still don't have access to capital.
Yeah, and it's a valid point for sure. But then I'd also say at the same time, when I was 19, which is 6 years ago, I didn't not only not have capital, I was like very broke, didn't have a job, and had a student debt that's large. And so it's sort of like, well, even though that I'm in you could say the first world, and you've got all this opportunity around you, it's all relative. Everyone's, most of the time, unless you've been given the money, or getting given money isn't even a good thing anyways, because most people that are given money lose it. So you have to earn it, and most people have to start from scratch. Everyone sort of has to start at scratch, and it's sort of, how do you think about that money? How far forward are you delegating that money into your life? Everyone's got to go and get a job, but how do you save it, and when are you going to invest it, and are you going to spend it straight away on a watch or an expensive car that you can't afford, or are you going to invest it back into yourself? And everyone has to make these decisions. And even if you're in the third world, it's the same, relative scale. They have their own economy. It might be slightly cheaper when it comes to us going over there and buying their food and renting their accommodation and so forth. But in their world, with their business structures and their business models, you can see the ones that I've met, heaps and heaps of them. They've come from obviously absolutely nothing and built these businesses locally. It's not a global business yet, but it's locally. They're doing really, really well for themselves. And they've had the same access to information, and they all attribute it to the same thing. It's education. It's just saving up, buying a smartphone, and just hooking into the free information that's on there, like on YouTube. There's so much free, good information on YouTube of how to do things.
Well, and the other thing is, talking about doing some real good things to help give back. There was a baseball player named Dave Valle, Valle, and he was a pro baseball player in Seattle. And he started a thing called Esperanza, which was microloans. And microloans are an amazing thing. I've for a long, long time, when my children would ask me, what do you want for Christmas? I would do something like, give a microloan to somebody in a third world country so they can buy, a goat or 3 goats or 20 chickens or, a beehive, with honeybees or something like that. The whole idea of giving access from the first world to the third world to people who literally want to create economics out of it, even on a small scale. We're not talking about trading stocks, right? But we're talking about going from no ability to be involved in capitalism or commerce to getting a $50 goat, which now they can sell goat milk every day. And then when that goat gets pregnant by another goat, it'll have another goat. And then that kind of thing has been something that I've always been involved in and thought was a really great idea. And there's lots of those kinds of microloan companies out there, but I've always thought the world of Dave Valle, and he came from the Dominican Republic, played pro baseball, made a fortune, and then started Esperanza.
Yeah, no, it's awesome, and it's a big initiative. We don't talk too much about it, but it's a big initiative that we have at Social Growth Media. Every client that we have, we sponsor a family somewhere around the world, because who knows why or how, but I feel like the more we do that, the more we give back. It's like, we've been given these crazy good opportunities, and it's sort of our responsibility to pay it forward and give the next generation of, I would call them potential business owners or people that need to have the same type of opportunity as us, give them a chance and see what comes out. I've seen some awesome things happen just by contributing what I would consider not too much. It's really not that much to take care of a whole family in the third world compared to what they can do with that money. But yeah, I really believe in all that sort of stuff. And the microloans one is a really good one too. I really do like that concept. So is there any sort of final points you want to go through, Chris, that you've got let's say books? What are some of the top 5, books that you'd recommend to anyone else to get started with or have a read of?
Well, I recommend a lot of books, and the ones that I find myself recommending a lot. One book is called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion, which is a sort of the science of influence. The other side of that, I would recommend my book, The Art of Influence, which I kind of consider obviously the art of the science. They got the science side of influence, you have the art side of influence. I've always liked a book called Positioning by Jack Trout and Al Ries. It's an old book now. Some of the examples are a little outdated, but the principles are timeless. I think that's an amazing book. I just recommended my favorite personal development book again today. It's called The Magic of Thinking Big by Dr. David Schwartz. I think that's a pretty amazing book. And then I think there's a lot of books that, Jim Rohn's book that I co-wrote with him, but it's really Jim's philosophy. It's a book called 12 Pillars. I think Psychology of Winning by Dennis Waitley, or his book, The Seeds of Greatness, both great books. I think any biographies or autobiographies of famous people, I think you can learn from people who've lived before us, I think is important. I would probably start with those books.
Yeah, no, they're really good. I have read a couple of those, and they're quality books. So if you're listening and you want some further research to do, have a look at those. We'll be linking them all up in the show notes below. Other than that there, Chris, I really want to thank you for coming on the show and just sharing some of the knowledge and experience that you've had and some of these stories too. It's been really good to have a chat with you there, Chris, and I look forward to getting you on again. Honestly, we can definitely look at doing more episodes in the future.
That would be great. I'd appreciate it.
Awesome, Chris. Well, again, thanks for having us. Thanks for being with us there, guys. If you're listening, if you want to check out some more of what Chris is doing in his work, we'll be linking everything up in the show notes. But he runs the Real Man podcast, which you may see a feature from me there soon. You'll also be able to go and grab a copy of his book. Is it already out?
The Dealmaker, I'm just starting to write, but The Art of Influence, which is my primary book that I give my speeches on, that's been out now for quite some time.
Awesome. All right. So The Art of Influence there, guys. And if you're listening from America, make sure you check in to one of his speeches. You're doing a lot of them, 1,200 so far. That's a decent amount of stages, to be honest.
That actually must be an old bio because I'm at about 2,500 now.
You're kidding. That's a lot. If you think about how many days there are in a year, that means you've been on a stage almost 7 years straight. Yeah. That's incredible, Chris. Well, looking forward to seeing your future work. And again, thanks for being on the show, and hope everybody that's listening has a great day.